the 12th of July, 1952. New York Mirror. Headline: Unknown man found in Harlem basement. Authorities refuse comment. The 13th of July, 1952. Amsterdam News. Front page. The mark of the Godfather. Syndicate hitman silenced. The 14th of July, 1952. FBI internal memo. Classified. Subject: Bumpy Johnson. Psychological warfare or local justice. Harlem during the heat wave of 1952 was not just sweltering from the weather, it was suffocating under the heat of gun barrels. In this landscape, the legal system was a ghost. It existed, but no one truly believed in its power to protect. When NYPD detectives descended into the rotting, damp basement of a tenement on 126th Street, they expected to process a routine gangland execution. But the air down there was different. It didn't just smell of death, it reeked of a cold, calculated warning. Under the flickering, weak beam of a flashlight, they found him sprawled in the filth. He was a white man, dressed in a silk suit that cost more than a detective's annual salary. He wasn't a local drifter or a street-level dealer. This was a professional hitman sent from the high-ranking Italian syndicate downtown, a man trained to kill and vanish into the shadows. But here, in Bumpy Johnson's territory, the hunter had become the prey. Detective O'Malley knelt beside the body, prepared to roll the victim over for a standard inspection. But as his light hit the hitman's chest, which had been ripped open along with his silk shirt, O'Malley froze. His breath caught in his throat. On the man's chest, it wasn't a bullet hole or a stab wound that greeted them. It was a message, carved deep into the flesh, with a precision that was as surgical as it was terrifying. It wasn't just a name, it was a list. Etched directly into the hitman's skin, right below the collarbone, were 3 four-digit numbers. They weren't random codes. They were the badge numbers of 3 NYPD officers, men notorious in the underworld as the inside men for the syndicate. And carved directly beneath those numbers was a single sentence written in a mixture of dark ink and drying blood. Harlem is closed to ghosts. Go back to the shadows or become one. O'Malley looked at his 2 partners, and for the first time in 20 years on the force, he saw raw, unfiltered horror in their eyes. It wasn't just the brutality of the corpse that terrified them. It was the realization that the first badge number on that list belonged to their own captain. They didn't call for the forensic team. They didn't secure the perimeter. They turned and fled that basement as if the devil himself were breathing down their necks. Bumpy Johnson didn't need to fire a single shot at the police to control the streets of Harlem. He simply showed them that he knew their deepest, most shameful secrets. He used the physical anatomy of a broken man to mirror the internal rot of the system. In the shadows of Harlem, the law wasn't written by judges in mahogany courtrooms. It was carved with a blade by a man who was done being disrespected. The question was no longer who killed the hitman. The question was, how did Bumpy uncover those secret badge numbers? And what else had that hitman confessed before his final breath was turned into a bloody message for the city to see? This wasn't just a murder. It was the beginning of a total war, and Bumpy Johnson had just signed the death warrants for everyone who thought they could invade Harlem without paying the ultimate price. The 15th of July, 1952. Private Journal of Detective O'Malley. Entry: We haven't slept in 48 hours. The captain is burning files. The air in the precinct is thick with the smell of sweat and fear. The 16th of July, 1952. The Daily News. Small column. Harlem basement case handed to federal authorities. Local police recuse themselves. Imagine you are standing on the corner of 125th and Lenox at 3 a.m. The city is silent, but it is not asleep. In Harlem, information moves like blood through an artery, constant, vital, and invisible to the naked eye. But when Bumpy Johnson carved those badge numbers into that hitman's chest, he didn't just stop the blood flow. He poisoned the entire system. While the syndicate downtown was screaming for blood and the NYPD captain was looking for a place to hide, Bumpy Johnson didn't react. He sat in his usual booth at the back of the Lenox Lounge, a statue of patience in a world of chaos. He wasn't waiting for the war to start. He was watching the enemy destroy themselves from the inside out. The information gap strategy. Bumpy knew something they didn't. He knew that fear is not caused by what you see, but by what you realize the other person knows about you. To understand how Bumpy got those badge numbers, you have to understand the whispers. This was his invisible nerve system, a network of shoeshine boys, jazz musicians, and war veterans who saw every bribe taken in a dark alley and every secret meeting in a Bronx hardware store. They were the eyes and ears of a community that the untouchable hitman thought was beneath his notice. Earlier that week, Bumpy's men had intercepted a low-level syndicate associate named Skinny Pete. Pete thought he was safe because he was small-time, but Bumpy understood that the smallest leak can sink the largest ship. Instead of traditional violence, Bumpy used a pain point strategy. He sat Pete down and showed him a photo of his own children playing in a park in Queens. "Do you believe in ghosts, Pete?" Bumpy asked, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated in the small room. "Because the men you work for, they think they are invisible. But in Harlem, even the shadows have names. Give me the names of the men who gave the green light, or your family will be the only thing people remember about you." Pete talked. He didn't just give names, he gave badge numbers. He revealed the rot that reached all the way to the captain's office. By the time the sun rose over the Hudson on July 16th, the syndicate realized their professional hitman hadn't just failed. He had become a map of their own corruption. Bumpy had successfully used physiognomy as a weapon. He turned a dead body into a living testimony of the syndicate's failures. But the syndicate was not done. They were about to send something much worse than a hitman. They were sending an army, and Bumpy was waiting, because in his world, silence is the deadliest weapon and action is the final sentence. The 17th of July, 1952. The New York Times. Headline: Mayor calls for emergency meeting with police commissioner. Silence from Harlem. The 18th of July, 1952. The Amsterdam News. Inside column: Bumpy Johnson seen at Lenox Lounge. The calm before the hurricane. In the underworld, there is a rule that books don't teach you. The loudest person in the room is the most afraid. On July 17th, the syndicate downtown was screaming. Their phones were ringing, their lawyers were scrambling, and their inside men in the NYPD were burning every scrap of evidence they had. But in Harlem, at the back of the Lenox Lounge, the air was still. Bumpy Johnson sat with a cup of tea, watching the steam rise, as if the world outside wasn't on the verge of a massacre. The strategic patience principle. In prison, you learn that hitting someone is easy. The hard part is knowing when to hit them. Bumpy wasn't just waiting. He was giving the syndicate enough rope to hang themselves. By mid-afternoon, the syndicate sent a fixer, a high-level negotiator named Alberto Rossi. Rossi walked into the Lenox Lounge expecting to find a gangster he could buy or bully. He didn't understand that he wasn't walking into a club. He was walking into a trap built out of psychological warfare. Rossi sat across from Bumpy and placed a briefcase on the table, $50,000 in cash, a fortune in 1952. "This is for the hitman's family," Rossi said, his voice trying to sound steady, "and for the inconvenience on his chest. Let's call it a misunderstanding and go back to business." Bumpy didn't look at the money. He didn't even look at Rossi. He looked at the mirror behind the bar, reflecting the faces of the black veterans standing at the door, men who had fought Nazis in Europe and were now ready to fight for their own bloc. "You think this is about money?" Bumpy's voice was a low, controlled hum that made the ice in Rossi's drink rattle. "When you send a man with a gun into my basement, you aren't just looking for a body. You are trying to tell me that Harlem is for sale. You are trying to tell these people that their safety is a commodity you can buy." Bumpy leaned forward, the shadows of the lounge carving deep lines into his face. "I didn't carve those badge numbers on your man's chest to ask for a bribe, Alberto. I carved them to show you that your invisible system is made of glass. I can see through it, I can reach through it, and I can shatter it whenever I choose." Rossi felt the information gap closing in on him. He realized that Bumpy didn't just have badge numbers, he had the names of the syndicate's payroll, their shipment routes, and their safe houses. The hitman in the basement hadn't just died. He had been a vulnerable pimple that Bumpy had squeezed to reveal all the pus inside the Syndicate's organization. "Take your money," Bumpy said, standing up, "and tell your bosses, Harlem isn't for sale, it's for protection. And starting tonight, the rent for the city just went up." As Rossi retreated, his face pale and his hands shaking, Bumpy turned to Illinois Gordon. The gathering storm was no longer a threat. It was a reality. Bumpy knew the Syndicate would retaliate with violence, but he had already achieved the first victory. He had moved the battlefield from the streets into their minds. But there was one secret Bumpy hadn't revealed yet. A second hitman was already in the city, and this one didn't work for the Syndicate. He was an independent shadow, and he had been hired by someone within the NYPD to finish what the first hitman started. The 19th of July, 1952. Intelligence report. Unconfirmed. Independent contractor sighted in Upper Manhattan. No Syndicate ties. No criminal record. A ghost with a rifle. The 20th of July, 1952. The Harlem Tattler. Rumor. The NYPD is no longer looking for a killer. They are looking for a way to erase the witness. In the high-stakes game of Harlem's underworld, the most dangerous enemy is not the one who screams, but the one you never see coming. While the Syndicate was busy nursing its bruised ego and Rossi was retreating with his $50,000 briefcase, a new predator had entered the ecosystem. This was the Shadow, a professional who operated outside the rules of the street and served only the highest bidder within the corrupt corridors of the NYPD. The survival instinct principle. Bumpy Johnson understood that when you corner a wounded beast like the NYPD captain, whose badge number was carved on a dead man's chest, they don't follow the law. They trigger their instinct to survive at any cost. Bumpy sat in the Lenox lounge, but his mind was already mapping the arteries of the city. He knew the Syndicate was a clogged toilet that could be managed, but this new threat was like rust, silent, invisible, and capable of destroying the structure from within. He used his invisible nerve system to track the tracker. "They sent a man who doesn't exist to kill a man they can't control," Bumpy whispered to Illinois Gordon, his voice as cold and sharp as a razor blade. He didn't use a life raft of bodyguards. He used strategic patience. He stayed in the light, making himself the bait, while his war veterans moved into the shadows of the surrounding rooftops. The Shadow was watching from a room in a flophouse across the street, his rifle assembled with surgical precision. He saw Bumpy through the crosshairs, a man who looked like a vulnerable pimple under the neon lights. But what the Shadow didn't see was the twist. Bumpy wasn't looking at the street. He was looking at the reflection in a small hand mirror on his table. Suddenly, Bumpy stood up and raised his glass toward the flophouse window. It wasn't a toast, it was a signal. In that microsecond, the Shadow realized the information gap had flipped. He wasn't the hunter. He was the one in the cage. Bumpy's voice carried through the silent lounge. "The system failed you before you even pulled the trigger. Now, the consequence has arrived." Before the Shadow could adjust his aim, a low, muffled thud echoed from the flophouse hallway. The door to his room didn't just open. It exploded. The war veterans' men who understood that silence is a strategy and action is a sentence were no longer waiting. But as they stormed the room, they found it empty. The Shadow had vanished, leaving behind only a single calling card on the floor, a photograph of the Lenox lounge, with a red X marked over Bumpy's head. The game had just shifted from psychological warfare into a lethal game of cat and mouse, and for the first time in 10 years, Bumpy Johnson felt the cold breath of a ghost on the back of his neck. The 21st of July, 1952. Precinct 28. Logbook. Entries missing. Ink spilled over the duty roster for the night shift. The 22nd of July, 1952. The Harlem Tattler. Headline: "The Blue Wall Cracks. Why are the sirens silent on 126th Street? When a man realizes he is standing in the dead zone of his own making, his actions become unpredictable and lethal." Captain Vance, the man whose badge number sat at the top of the carved list, knew that Bumpy Johnson hadn't just found his secret. He had turned Vance's own skin into a public indictment. In the world of prison legends, when the system fails to protect the corrupt, they trigger the survival instinct, and go scorched earth. Vance didn't just want Bumpy dead. He wanted the Lenox Lounge to become a cemetery of silence. He ordered a cleanup raid, not a legal one, but a midnight operation using off-duty officers and hired thugs designed to erase every witness who had ever seen a bribe change hands. The self-preservation activation. A cornered beast does not hunt for food. It hunts to eliminate the threat of its own exposure. But Bumpy Johnson was a master of the information gap. He didn't wait for the sirens to wail. He used his invisible nerve system to read the atmosphere of the precinct. He knew that when the phones at the Lenox Lounge went dead and the streetlights on his block were cut, the consequence had arrived. As Vance's cleanup crew moved through the shadows of 126th Street, they found the Lenox Lounge wide open, its neon lights buzzing in the humid night. There were no bodyguards at the door. There was only Bumpy, sitting alone at the bar, his hand mirror reflecting the dark hallway behind the invaders. "You think you are cleaning the clogged toilet of Harlem?" Bumpy's voice was a low, surgical hum that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. "But you forgot that when you flush, the waste has to go somewhere. Tonight, it stops here." Suddenly, the twist was revealed. The men Vance had sent were not met by gangsters. They were met by the silence of the Harlem veterans, who had rigged the building not for a fight, but for a trap. Bumpy hadn't just baited the Shadow in Part 4. He had used the Shadow's own calling card to lure Vance's crew into an information gap that would become their legal grave. As Vance's men realized they were surrounded not by guns, but by cameras and independent journalists from the Amsterdam News, the information gap shattered. Bumpy had turned the shadow of violence into the light of public exposure. But as the flashbulbs popped, a single red laser dot appeared on Bumpy's chest, not from Vance's crew, but from a rooftop 3 blocks away. The Shadow was still in the game, and this time he wasn't looking for a list. He was looking for the heart of the legend. The 23rd of July, 1952. Unmarked police file. Missing ballistic report. Ballistics team sent to the wrong rooftop on purpose. The 24th of July, 1952. Private ledger of Bumpy Johnson. Entry. A ghost only exists if you believe in the haunting. Tonight, we exorcise the shadows. The red laser dot resting on Bumpy's chest was not just a threat, it was a consequence that had finally arrived. In the underworld, they call this the Red Dot Symphony, a lethal performance where the first person to flinch is the first to die. But Bumpy Johnson did not flinch. He did not dive for cover or reach for the .45 tucked into his waistband. Instead, he sat as still as a stone monument, a master of strategic patience in a world of frantic, desperate men. You see, the Shadow thought he held the ultimate information gap. From his perch on the roof of the Hotel Teresa, looking through a high-powered scope, he believed he controlled the distance between his finger and the trigger. He believed that silence was his shield, but he forgot one fundamental rule. In Harlem, the very air you breathe is owned by Bumpy Johnson. While Captain Vance's scorched earth crew was being blinded by the flashbulbs of the press inside the Lenox Lounge, the Shadow was focused. He was a professional, a ghost with no name and no record. But Bumpy's invisible nerve system, the midnight janitors, the elevator operators, and the street-side vendors had already mapped the Shadow's movement hours ago. They didn't need radios or sirens. They read the body language of the block. A window left open that should be locked. A pigeon taking flight from a ledge where it usually slept. A ghost can only haunt you if you allow him to stay in the dark, Bumpy whispered into the humid air of the lounge, his voice a low, surgical hum that carried the weight of a final sentence. Suddenly, the massive neon sign of the Hotel Teresa began to flicker. It wasn't an electrical malfunction or a short circuit. It was a rhythmic code, a signal from the Harlem War veterans who had already infiltrated the hotel's basement. They were no longer waiting for permission. They were re-establishing order. The Shadow felt the vibration through the gravel of the roof before he heard a single sound. Then came the twist. It wasn't a bullet that broke the symphony. It was a total blackout. Every streetlight and neon sign in a 3-block radius went dark, except for one. A single, blinding industrial spotlight from a fire truck below swung upward, pinning the shadow against the brickwork like a moth caught on a curtain. The shadow was no longer a ghost. He was a vulnerable pimple exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of Harlem justice. But as Bumpy's veterans stormed the rooftop, they didn't find a trembling assassin. The shadow stood at the edge of the ledge, his rifle already disassembled and packed away. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was holding out a hand, and in that hand was a badge, a solid gold shield that belonged to the police commissioner himself. The information gap had just become a canyon. This wasn't a mob hit or a rogue cop's revenge. This was a state-sponsored execution. Bumpy Johnson looked at the reflection in his hand mirror and realized that the list carved on that first hitman's chest was only the first page of a map that led directly to the heart of the city's power. The 25th of July, 1952. The New York Journal, headline, "Strange Silence at City Hall. Commissioner Absent from Emergency Briefing." The 26th of July, 1952. Amsterdam News. Front page, "Justice isn't found in law books. Harlem now holds the key to the city." In the high-stakes world of strategic violence, true power doesn't reside in the barrel of a gun. It resides in what your enemy cannot afford to lose. When Bumpy Johnson's veterans surrounded the roof of the Hotel Teresa and seized the solid gold shield of the police commissioner, they didn't just capture an assassin. They captured the very soul of New York's legal system. Bumpy stood by the window of his office, looking down at the flickering neon lights of Harlem as they fought against the encroaching night. He didn't order the execution of the shadow. He understood that a corpse is merely a waste of information, but a gold shield in the right hands is a death sentence hanging over the heads of the most powerful men in the city. The information gap strategy. Bumpy knew the commissioner was the mastermind. The commissioner knew Bumpy held his shield, but the public knew nothing. It was in this silence, this specific gap, where Bumpy began to build a new order. "A badge can protect a man from the law," Bumpy said, his voice a low, surgical hum that seemed to cut through the humid air, but it cannot protect him from the rot he has spent a lifetime cultivating. Instead of sending a threat, Bumpy executed a classic culotte KO, the counter move. He didn't return the shield to the precinct. He didn't leak it to the press. Instead, he sent a single high-resolution photograph of the gold shield placed next to a detailed ledger of the Syndicate's heroin routes that the police had been paid to ignore, directly to the desk of the Federal Bureau of Ledger. Investigation. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for immunity. He demanded a total cleanup. Instantly, the survival instinct of the city's elite was triggered. They realized Bumpy didn't want to destroy them. He wanted to restructure them. The gold shield was no longer a symbol of authority. It was an invisible set of handcuffs forcing the commissioner to betray the syndicate just to save his own skin. On the night of July 26th, a secret meeting took place in the neutral zone, the middle of Central Park. No bodyguards, no obvious weapons. Just Bumpy Johnson and the man who supposedly ran the city's police force. "What do you want, Bumpy?" the commissioner asked, cold sweat tracing lines down his face despite the cool night breeze. Bumpy slowly turned the ring on his finger, his eyes as cold as a frozen lake in midwinter. "I want you to do the job that SHIELD actually represents. Starting tonight, every syndicate shipment moving through Harlem will be seized. Not by my men, but by yours." The war was no longer between Bumpy and the police. Bumpy had successfully turned the police into his own private enforcement arm to dismantle his rivals. But the shadow was still breathing, and he was holding one final secret, a secret that could bring both Bumpy's empire and City Hall crashing down into the dirt. The 27th of July, 1952. Intelligence report, FBI. Observation: massive movement of syndicate trucks on the outskirts of Manhattan. NYPD presence redirected to minor traffic violations. The 28th of July, 1952. The Amsterdam News. Front page: the siege of 125th Street. When the law becomes the enforcer for the street. When you hold a man's solid gold shield, you don't just hold his reputation, you hold his leash. The police commissioner was now a vulnerable pimple caught between two grinding gears: the syndicate's demands for protection and Bumpy Johnson's demand for a total cleanup. In the world of strategic violence, the greatest weapon is forcing your enemy to kill his own allies. The self-preservation activation. The commissioner realized that Bumpy wasn't looking for a bribe. Bumpy was looking for an executioner. To save his own career and avoid a federal prison cell, the commissioner had to sacrifice the syndicate. On the night of July 27th, the syndicate made its move. They believed they still owned the arteries of the city. They sent 3 armored trucks loaded with pure heroin, a $2 million shipment straight through the heart of Harlem. They expected the inside men to open the gates. They expected the sirens to stay silent. But they didn't account for the information gap that Bumpy had surgically created. Bumpy didn't use his own men to stop the trucks. He sat on the balcony of the Lenox Lounge, a statue of strategic patience, watching through binoculars as the NYPD, the very men who had been on the syndicate's payroll 24 hours ago, blocked the intersection of 125th and 7th Avenue. The syndicate drivers were confused. They flashed their special clearance lights, but the officers didn't move. These weren't the regular beat cops. These were the commissioner's elite tactical squad, acting under the direct threat of the gold shield evidence Bumpy held. "You're in the wrong neighborhood, boys," the lead officer said, his voice trembling with a mixture of duty and fear. When the syndicate drivers reached for their weapons, they triggered the consequence. It wasn't a gang war. It was a state-sponsored slaughter. The NYPD opened fire, not to arrest, but to erase the evidence of their own corruption. In 10 minutes, the syndicate's $2 million shipment was a scorched ruin on the pavement of Harlem. Bumpy watched the flames rise, the light reflecting in his eyes. He hadn't fired a single bullet, yet he had just cost the syndicate their largest profit margin of the decade and forced the police to commit the ultimate betrayal. But as the smoke cleared, the twist emerged. The Shadow, the elite assassin with the gold shield, was no longer in police custody. He had escaped during the blackout at the Hotel Teresa, and he had taken something from Bumpy's office that was more valuable than any ledger. He had taken the original list, the one carved onto the hitman's chest. The war was no longer about heroin or badges. It was about the physical evidence of the crime. If the Shadow delivered that skin to the syndicate's high council, Bumpy's invisible nerve would be exposed, and the community of Harlem would face a retaliation that no gold shield could stop. The 29th of July, 1952. FBI confidential report. Subject: The Shadow has vanished with physical evidence. Risk of total intelligence breach in Harlem at red alert levels. 30 juli 1952. Amsterdam News. Headline: Harlem holds its breath. Bumpy Johnson leaves the Lenox Lounge for the first time in 72 hours. In the art of crowd control, the greatest fear isn't death, it is exposure. When the Shadow escaped with the piece of skin containing the list of corrupt officers, he wasn't just holding a trophy, he was holding the death sentence of Bumpy Johnson's entire invisible nerve network. If that list reached the syndicate's high council, every shoeshine boy, every jazz musician, and every war veteran serving as Bumpy's eyes would be erased in a single night of fire. Bumpy Johnson did not panic. He understood that in a clogged toilet like the New York legal system, a man holding leverage will always head toward the highest bidder. The Shadow wasn't loyal to the syndicate, nor was he loyal to the commissioner. He was loyal only to his own survival instinct. The information gap strategy. The enemy believes they are hunting you, but in reality, you are herding them into a space where every exit has already been locked from the outside. Bumpy didn't use an army to find the Shadow. He used silence. He ordered all of Harlem to stop. No music, no gambling, no noise. This absolute silence created an immense psychological pressure, making the assassin feel like a vulnerable pimple being squeezed between the darkness and the inevitable hunt. At 2 a.m. on July 30th, Bumpy appeared at a derelict warehouse on the Hudson River, the exact location where the Shadow was preparing to trade the evidence to a high-ranking syndicate representative. "You think that piece of skin is your shield?" Bumpy's voice rang out, low and cold as the sound of steel sliding against a cell door. "But in reality, it is a magnet for every bullet from both sides. You aren't holding evidence. You are holding a ticking time bomb." The Shadow stood in the rafters, rifle ready, but he suddenly realized the twist. The men sent by the syndicate didn't arrive with a briefcase of cash. They arrived with canisters of gasoline. They didn't want to buy the secret. They wanted to burn the evidence, the shadow, and the truth along with it to protect their own rot. In that microsecond, the shadow's survival instinct flipped. He realized the only man who could help him escape the Syndicate's scorched earth protocol wasn't his employer, it was the very man he was hired to kill, Bumpy Johnson. "Give it to me." Bumpy stepped into the dim light, his eyes reflecting the distant, cold flickers of the city. "And I will show you how a ghost truly vanishes from this world without leaving a single footprint." The confrontation wasn't a loud gunfight, it was a ruthless execution of strategy. Bumpy turned the transaction into a trap, eliminating the Syndicate's final enforcers while recovering the nerves of Harlem. However, as Bumpy opened the box containing the carved evidence, he noticed a terrifying detail. A fourth badge number had been freshly carved into the list. A badge number Bumpy had never seen before. Whose number was it, and why did it appear only now, at the very end of the war? The 1st of August 1952, New York Times Special Bulletin. Headline: Resignation Wave Rocks City Hall. Police Commissioner and Special Prosecutor arrested on organized crime charges. 2 Augustus 1952. Amsterdam News. Front page: Order restored. Bumpy Johnson and the lesson of ruthless silence. When Bumpy Johnson looked at the fourth number freshly carved into the hitman's skin, the atmosphere in the room turned brittle, as if the air itself had been flash frozen. That badge number didn't belong to a street cop, a detective, or even a precinct captain. It was the honorary gold shield number of the special prosecutor, the very man the city had appointed to clean up the corruption of New York. The information gap was finally closed, and the truth was more staggering than any fiction. The head of the clogged toilet wasn't the Syndicate downtown, it was the man holding the scales of justice in the courtroom. The prosecutor had been using the Syndicate as his private hammer to crush political rivals, and he had used the shadow to erase the fingerprints. Bumpy Johnson stood at the precipice of a historic decision. He had the names, he had the men. He could have initiated a massacre that would have turned the Hudson red for a week. But in the world of strategic violence, Bumpy knew that death is often a mercy. He chose a far more devastating weapon: total moral annihilation. The final consequence principle: when the system fails, you don't just dismantle it, you force it to stand naked under the sun and expose its own rot until it collapses under the weight of its own shame. Bumpy didn't deliver the skin to the newspapers or the police station. Instead, he had it gift-wrapped. On the day of the special prosecutor's daughter's high society wedding, a package was delivered to the head table. Inside was the original carved list, accompanied by a recorded confession from the shadow that detailed every bribe, every hit, and every betrayal. Bumpy didn't fire a single bullet that day. He didn't have to. He had shattered the moral shell these men had spent their entire lives constructing. By the time the cake was cut, the FBI was already through the doors. Within 24 hours, the system began to devour itself to survive. The commissioner turned on the prosecutor. The prosecutor ratted out the Syndicate High Council. Those who once believed they were untouchable were now fleeing like rats from a house engulfed in flames. The scorched earth they had planned for Harlem had instead consumed their own legacies. On the final night of the war, Bumpy Johnson returned to his booth at the Lenox Lounge. He sat in the shadows, a statue of strategic patience, and watched as the music returned to 125th Street. The jazz was louder tonight. It wasn't just entertainment. It was the sound of a community that had reclaimed its soul and its dignity from the jaws of a corrupt beast. As for the shadow, he vanished into the night, exactly as Bumpy had promised. He wasn't dead, but he was no longer a hunter. He became a true ghost, a man without a name, living in eternal, shivering fear that Bumpy Johnson might one day decide that his vanishing was no longer enough. "Harlem isn't just a neighborhood you can invade or buy," Bumpy whispered as he closed his ledger for the last time. "It is a statement. If you respect the people, you have a home. If you challenge their dignity, you become nothing more than a number on the chest of a dead man." The War of 1952 ended not with a bang, but with a terrifying, absolute silence. Bumpy Johnson had proven the ultimate lesson. True justice doesn't live in gold shields, mahogany courtrooms, or law books. It lives in the hearts of those who refuse to be afraid when the world tells them they are nothing.